Hi everybody, Joey here again and welcome back. So today marks the first video of a 5-part series on how I built my office aquarium. Now this is a really interesting build that I know a lot of you are really going to enjoy because there's a lot of unique aspects to it. Of course I built everything for it, but in this series you're going to see things like how I built the aquarium itself, how I built the filtration, the stand, lighting, how I set it up, all the equipment, how it all works, and of course the stocking and aquascaping. Now the thing about this build, and really do-it-yourself in general, is that nobody in the world has a system like this, but I'm going to show you how I did it so you could potentially build it yourself, or simply get some inspiration and use bits and pieces to apply to your own build. This build had a lot of unique challenges and obstacles that I had to overcome, yet the final outcome is actually one of my favorite builds out of the last few years. Now if you've been following me for any amount of time, you'll remember the 375-gallon acrylic tank build that we just did. You'll also remember that after I built this tank, there was a lot of spare acrylic left over. Now, some of that acrylic I used to build my planted aquarium, which is set up and running right now. And I know a lot of you want to see that build, and it's coming. If you follow me on Facebook, I actually announced the exact date that that build is coming out. So if you're not following me on Facebook, I suggest you do, because it's really easy for me to give you updates like that. Now let's focus on the office tank build. You'll notice that my office is rearranged tremendously. And it is. I had to do quite a bit of renovations to make this happen. I wasn't planning on it, but to accommodate this new build, I had to. And I gotta tell you, I'm entirely pleased that I did. In the future, at some point, when all these series comes out and you see all these tanks that are now in this room, I want to do an office tank tour so you can see everything that I see. I don't know exactly when that tour will come out, but if you're subscribed to this channel, you'll of course get a notification when it does. So like I said, there was a lot of scrap acrylic left over from the 375-gallon tank. It was a lot of odd dimensions of acrylic, but it's some really good pieces, and I had to get creative with it. I had a number of options, yet let's just go ahead and watch what I mentioned before so I can bring you guys up to speed. Now, speaking of getting creative, I still have no idea what I want to do with all of this scrap acrylic. Now, I'll remind you, this piece is 3/4 inch and these two pieces are 3/4 inch cell cast acrylic. This piece here is 6 feet long, 2 feet wide. These two pieces here are 8 feet long and 1 foot wide. These are some pretty sizable pieces of scrap acrylic from the 375-gallon tank build. I should also mention that out of the scrap acrylic from that build, I also already built that planted aquarium cube. We'll take a look at that in a minute though. So I'd like to do one of two things here. I'd like to build some tanks that are either interesting or very useful, or hopefully the both. So we actually talked in the past where I was going to build a tank that would line the wall of my desk, and it would run the length of my desk. However, it would only be about 8 inches front to back, 12 inches tall, and then run the length of the tank. I think that would make for a really interesting tank, and obviously I would get to see it all the time. However, in the live streams on Facebook that I've done, some of you have even suggested doing a large, tall column tank. For example, with this scrap acrylic, I could do a 6-foot tall tank, but it would only be 12 inches around on each side. That would be pretty fun and interesting to see, but I don't think it would be that useful and or practical for stocking. Although I'd be curious to see what you guys would do with it. Last but not least, there's the more practical approach in simply taking the acrylic and building some cube tanks. With the amount of acrylic that I have here, I could build 5 cube tanks, all of which would be 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches. What I would do with all 5, I don't know. Then I could do something more rectangular, like 3 tanks that are 24 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches. Or potentially a mixture of cube tanks and rectangular tanks. So I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on those 4 options, or perhaps you have another idea given the dimensions that I have here. Again, I'm going to let you guys vote, and a pop-up should appear right now. I'll wait to see what you guys think before we move any further with this. So I let you guys vote on what I should do with it, and 74% of you said that I should build the long desk tank. The problem there is I kind of mismeasured how things could go. You see, the desk itself is 90 inches long and 60 inches wide. It's actually a U-shaped desk, so it goes all around here. Now, I couldn't build a 90-inch long tank because there wasn't enough acrylic to do so. I guess I could have, but the tank would have only been about 8 inches wide and 8 inches tall. There's no way I was going to waste the acrylic on that. Although that might have been a pretty neat tank. However, I wanted something more practical. I also didn't want to build it 60 inches long because I could only build it 12 inches wide and 12 inches tall. It'd be a relatively small tank. I wanted to get the biggest tank possible. out of this, but yet keep it long and narrow. mainly because there's not really tanks out there like that, and I wanted to get creative with the stocking. Although I knew exactly what I wanted to keep right from the beginning. So what I ended up doing was taking that long piece that was 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, I cut it right down the center. That gave me 2 pieces that were 6 feet long and 1 foot wide. This would serve as the front and the back of the actual tank. Then I took one of those longer 8-foot pieces that were 8 feet long by 1 feet wide, and I cut that into 3 pieces. One that would be 6 feet long and the others would be 1 foot long each. The longer piece would serve as the bottom of the tank, and the 2 1-foot pieces would serve as the sides of the tank. So this would end up being a tank that's 6 feet long, 1 feet wide, and 1 foot tall, which gives me about 45 gallons. Now this size aquarium is more practical to the majority of my viewers. I know many of you are not going to be able to build or have any ambitions to build these massive tanks. So I know this office tank will inspire many more of you than these ones would, although these ones are pretty cool themselves. With that tank decided though, it still leaves me with a piece of acrylic that's 8 feet long and 1 feet wide. And remember, this is 3/4 inch cell cast acrylic. With that extra sheet, I'm going to build another tank with it. And I have a good idea for it. So this tank being 6 feet long, 1 feet wide, and 1 foot tall, it would look awkward going on the 90-inch length of the desk, and it would jut out if I went the 60-inch length of it. So I decided I'd move the desk out of the way, and I'd expose a large area on the wall. You'll probably remember the mirror that I glued to the wall previously was there, and I had to remove that, and I mostly broke it and ripped apart the wall. But that's fine because the stand covers it anyway. But this new gap in the wall leaves me with a nice 80-inch length to work with. However, now I'm taking up a massive amount of real estate in a relatively small office where I value storage tremendously. So I really had to take that into consideration when I was building the stand. And that's where this build gets really interesting. But we'll get to that in a couple videos. So with that all out of the way, and with you guys brought up to speed with why I made these decisions, let's talk about how I built this tank. Again, this tank was 6 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 1 foot tall, made out of 3/4 inch cell cast acrylic. Now, given its width and height, I knew automatically I'm not going to need any bracing, so this was going to be a braceless tank, which looks really good once done. To start off, cutting up the acrylic is pretty simple. I used a 10-inch 80-tooth carbide tip blade. Now, given that we're using a 3/4 inch material, this means that the welding or cementing method has to apply to its thickness. Now, typically, you guys have seen me use a method called the capillary method. Now, that method is really simple and easy to do with thinner acrylic. You just have to put 2 pieces together and run some cement along the seam. Capillary action wicks the acrylic into the seam and it softens it and cements it together. However, on 3/4 inch, it's too wide to be able to do that, and it doesn't wick in far enough. You can try to get it at both sides, but it just ends up making a mess and a horrible seam. Yet the capillary method is tremendously easy. However, we'll be applying the pin method to this aquarium. The first thing you always have to do is peel back the protective paper that's on the acrylic. You can peel a couple inches back and tape it back, or just rip it right off. We do this because if any cement gets on that protective paper, it makes a mess of the acrylic. And it's easier to actually see what you're doing. Now, because we're using the pin method, I didn't really need to prepare the edges as well as I normally would. You see, when building an acrylic aquarium, the edges are everything. If your edges are not flat and true, you're going to have a horrible seam. Even with using the blade that I use, you can tend to get some saw marks within it, and you have to remove those. However, the pin method allows the acrylic to melt more before you actually fuse them together, which means all of these light saw marks are basically going to turn into mush and then cement together. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Now, putting an aquarium together while using the pin method on larger aquariums is much different than putting a smaller aquarium or even a larger aquarium using the capillary method. Using the capillary method is very similar to, say, putting together a glass aquarium. Yet using the pin method, we approach it much differently. However, this tends to take a lot longer, but results are usually a lot better. You want to start off with either the front or the back panel, laying it down. Then take one of the ends and brace it. You can use a number of things to square off this piece and hold it there. Personally, I just rig up a square with using some plywood. This holds it together for me, and I don't have to worry about it being level or square, or even have to hold it. It does it all for me. Next comes the pins. You want to find the smallest pins possible. These are tiny little bobby pins, but you can use something like acupuncture pins or even small sewing pins. Personally, I like to use ones that have a little nub on the end so that when I pull them out, I have something to grip onto. Pins need to be approximately every 8 to 12 inches. It really depends on the length of the tank that you're cementing together, but for this one, I just used 2 pins because it's only a 12-inch length. If I only used one, it's going to wobble back and forth, so obviously I need to use 2. Now the way this works is those pins slightly elevate the acrylic away from each other. Then we take a syringe or an applicator bottle filled with Weldon 4. Weldon 4 is a popular acrylic cement. Using the syringe or applicator bottle, we start squirting in the Weldon 4 into the seam. Now I actually own a router, so I like to have a tiny bit of acrylic overhanging. And the reason I do that is because if my cuts are off by even a little bit, it's going to ruin the tank. So what I prefer to do is move the panel in slightly and then route it off later. I'll show you more on that in a minute. Once we've filled up the entire seam with Weldon 4, we wait approximately 90 to 120 seconds, or 1.5 to 2 minutes. It's best to actually time this out if you have somebody with you, especially if you've never done this before. Personally, for me, I use my fingers. I keep touching the cement and waiting until when I pull my fingers apart, there's cement in it, almost like a cobweb. Now the cement by itself won't actually do that. It's water thin and it evaporates off your finger after a few seconds. However, what's creating that webbing is the acrylic is softening, and that's when you know it's ready. At this point, we pull the pins. You do need clamps. You want to clamp it together. You don't need a tremendous amount of force, but you do want a firm clamp. This just simply squeezes it together and ensures you get a bubble-free seam. Now because we've softened the acrylic, we've fused it on a molecular level. And that's why a well put together acrylic aquarium technically doesn't have any seams. Now we wait. Now technically after about 20 minutes you can start moving this around, pulling the clamps off and that sort of thing. However, I highly suggest you wait until the next day. Why? It guarantees the seam is fused together properly and cured. However, it actually takes a full 7 days for the cure to reach 100% strength. After 24 hours though, it's up to about 80% strength. If you pull your clamps too soon or you start moving it around, you run a high risk of ruining that seam, introducing bubbles, or simply just making a mess out of the tank. And the thing with acrylic is, while it's really easy to put together, it is unforgiving to mistakes. You make a mistake and there's no taking it back. Unlike a glass aquarium, for example, if you mess up putting that together, wait till it cures, take it apart, and do it again. With an acrylic aquarium, there's no turning back. Now that we have one end on, we can move to the other. We literally do the exact same thing as we did for the first seam. Again, wait to 24 hours, and then we can move on. Now it gets kind of tricky. We have to flip the tank upside down and cement both ends to the other side. However, once you flip this contraption over, depending on how long the span of this is and how thick your acrylic is, it's going to bow. Now bowing isn't a big deal with acrylic, it has a high tensile strength, really difficult to actually snap it, but the problem is that when they bows in the middle, it pushes out the ends, and we can't have that happening. So when cutting up your acrylic, make sure that you cut up a spare piece of plywood or wood the same width as the end panels, so that when you flip this over, you can stick that in between and it stops it from bowing. Now you can do the exact same thing we did to the other sides, to the bottom sides. Again, square them off, put the pins in, apply the cement, wait 1.5 to 2 minutes, and pull the pins. Pulling the pins by hand is not advisable because they are actually stuck in there pretty good, so get a pair of pliers or vice grips or a tool of some sort that will help you pull them out. Just make sure that you brace the side when you're actually pulling it out. Now this thing's starting to look like a fish tank. The last panel is the bottom panel. Now, as long as the rest of this was squared up, even though this is the most cementing, it's actually the easiest because all the hard work is done. You just have to put it in place, prop the pins under it, get some clamps in place and ready, and start cementing. Now, this is technically 14 feet of cementing I have to do, and I should have had somebody there with me that could have pulled the pins because cementing this will take longer than 2 minutes. It will probably take me 3 to 5 minutes to actually cement the whole thing. And in doing so, I might not be able to pull the pins in time, which will potentially lead to a seam with bubbles in it or one that is not perfectly clear. Why? Because the acrylic is starting to soften up and oxygen gets into it. So I highly advise you, if you are building a big tank, to have somebody there with you that can, all they have to do is pull the pins right behind you after a certain time. For me, I figured I could move fast enough to get to them in time, which I did, and I kinda lucked out. However, I was really pushing the limit here. After cementing the entire bottom in place and pulling the pins and tightening the clamps, I waited another 24 hours. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that I put the tank up on some wood blocks. I only did this so I can actually get my clamps under it. The downside to building a big tank using the pin method is that you do need a lot of clamps. Luckily for me, I buy them up when I see them on sale. The next day I came back with my router and routed off all of the additional edges. Now I used a double flute 1/4 inch router bit and just ran the entire perimeter of all of the tank. Now the tank is essentially done. It's time to polish it. Now with thinner acrylic, this is really easy. You could take a propane torch or a MAP gas torch and simply flame the edges and it will polish them to be crystal clear. However, on the thicker acrylic, it's really difficult to accomplish this. Why? Because the acrylic is just so thick, it takes a lot longer to flame polish it, and while doing so, well, acrylic's actually flammable. And the longer you have to flame polish, the higher chances it has of catching on fire. Usually it's not going to catch on fire, but you will find that you burn more than you polish. However, there's a lot of plastic polishers out there. I prefer to use Novus products simply because it's available to me. There's a lineup of 3 of them. I've actually shown you guys how to remove scratches from aquariums in past videos, including glass and acrylic aquariums. And when removing scratches from an acrylic aquarium, I showed you how to use Novus. Novus 2 is fine scratch removal, and Novus 3 is heavy scratch removal. Now you can use a combination of 3 and 2, but most likely you'll only need 2. All you have to do is apply a bit to the acrylic you intend to polish, or apply it to a buffing wheel and buff it out. It actually buffs it out really quick. However, it can make a bit of a mess. However, after using it, you go from having a seam you can't see through to having a crystal clear seam. Again, the downside to it is it's a bit messy. So as you can see here, although the seams are clear, there's still lots of polish everywhere. I don't worry about that until I'm ready to remove the protective paper anyways. So that was it. That's how I built the office tank. Again, just to summarize, the tank is 6 feet long, 1 foot wide, 1 foot tall, being about 45 gallons in capacity. And again, one of my new favorite tanks. Next week, we're going to move on to how I built the filtration for this aquarium. If so far you're interested in this build, or are looking forward to the filtration portion of this build or anything else that I have planned for, and you're not a subscriber, I invite you to do so you don't miss out on any of this. I should also mention that if you are interested in building your own aquariums, whether it be glass, acrylic, or plywood, I did cover them in far more detail in my book, The Ultimate Do-It-Yourself Handbook for the Do-It-Yourself Aquarist, and you can get your copy at thekingofdiy.com, where it comes in ebook as well as softcover version. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. I also wanted to thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next Sunday for part 2 of the Office Tank build series.